What's up guys, it's Scott here and welcome back to FudgeMuppet. Today I'm excited to share with you our latest creation. Anyone itching for a new badass Fallout build, you're in luck. This guy is an absolute beast and his name is the Viking. Anglos of the Commonwealth beware, because the Viking invasion isn't over yet. Hailing from Sweden, the Viking moved to pre-war Boston, bringing all of his culture and heritage, and now that the world has turned to rubble, the Viking is climbing to the top of what remains, embodying the honor, courage, and strength of the Norse gods, and destroying his enemies with his berserker rage. This build is a hard hitter, and with a combination of massive damage, insane mobility, and an infinite resource of critical hits, nothing will get in his way. This build feels powerful and the results are visceral and satisfying when you chop through your foes with your mighty axe. Before we get into the build, don't forget that we have timestamps in the description to help you find your way around the video, but with that out of the way, let's start with the Viking's backstory and basic values. So the Viking was born in Sweden and grew up in a small town. His father was a Swede, but his mother was American and had met the Viking's father in her travels. At school, he learned to speak English, as most non-Western Europeans did, and lived a relatively standard young life. At the age of 10, the Viking's American grandfather died, and the three of them decided to move to the United States as his mother was beginning to miss her home. The Viking had very little to say in this, and on the long journey west, he had been allowed to bring only one small suitcase of belongings. When they moved into their new home on a large plot of land in the outer suburbs of Boston, the Viking was overcome with homesickness. He spoke English fluently, but the American accents, especially the ones in Boston, made things incredibly difficult for him. The only connection he had to his old life were a pair of comic books printed in Swedish. He had one comic which told the story of the Norse god Thor, the hot-headed god of thunder, and another on the god of war, Tyr, as he battled Loki and his monstrous wolf son, Fenrir. The Viking's father had a similarly difficult time assimilating too, but he saw how severely it affected his son, who was about to start his schooling life in a new country. The day before school began, his father took him to a comic book shop to look for more like the two he had at home, even if they were printed in English. The trip was bittersweet. He enjoyed the excursion with his father, but was devastated to find nothing of the Norse gods, not even Odin. The Viking's head sunk in disappointment. The Silver Shroud didn't appeal to him, but as they started to leave, he noticed Grognak the Barbarian, and while it was unlike anything he'd read before, the immense power of Grognak fighting a mythical beast on the cover of the comic filled the Viking with excitement. He bought the comic and read it on the train ride home. The next day, school began, and the Viking was overwhelmed. It didn't take long before the local boys with a Bostonian accent started mocking him, mimicking the way he spoke. The main culprit was taller than him and the others by a head, and he was as ugly as Fenrir's ass. His name was Loki. Loki was the kind of kid who ran out of creative insults quickly and compensated by resorting to fighting. But the Vikings steered clear of him. Despite being an active youth, the Viking spent the first few months of his American school life in the library. Here he was actually able to find books on his favorite gods, and one even depicted the old pagan religion of Odinism. The Viking was fascinated despite the lack of illustrations and borrowed the book for as long as the library would allow. The Viking read all about Odinism, learning more and more about the many gods of the pantheon, and he even began modeling his morals around the Odinic rite. The ninth rite spoke of perseverance against all hardship, and the Viking translated this into dealings with Loki. The following foul winter's day, the Viking decided to spend his lunchtime on the playground instead of it in the library. It was pouring down with rain, but he didn't mind. The cold reminded him of home. His fun was soon spoiled by Loki and his lackeys who came over to him in the playground. Before they could sling their insults, the weather turned for worse and thunder began rolling through the sky. The teacher on duty called all of the children back inside, and the Viking was the last to listen, letting the bullies go in ahead. As he entered the double doors to the school's hallway, he turned to see a ferocious bolt of lightning smite a tree mere meters from where he'd been standing a minute earlier. The Viking swore that in that moment he'd seen Thor's hammer strike where Loki had stood. The Viking saw that hammer every time he closed his eyes for the next few days, and he knew he would someday have to stand up to Loki. Over the next few years, the Viking grew in size, and his strength was increasing as he helped his father chop wood in the backyard every evening after school. As far as chores went, he enjoyed chopping wood. When he brought the axe down, he imagined himself as the mighty Tyr, splitting his enemies in half. By this time, the Viking had assimilated pretty well. His accent had all but gone, and he'd gotten much taller. Loki, on the other hand, hadn't. Once he'd been the tallest in their age group, but now he was just average. Only his attitude had never stopped growing. On his way home from school on a pleasant Friday afternoon, the Viking noticed Loki standing at the school gates. The Viking ignored him. He would just picture Loki's head on the first chunk of wood he chopped. But as the Viking walked past, ignoring him, Loki pushed the Viking firmly from behind, sending him sprawling to the concrete. The Viking's face hit the ground hard, and after pressing his fingers to his cheekbone, he saw that they were covered in blood. The sight of red sent the berserker rage through him, and he whispered Odin's words to himself, strength over weakness. He stood and turned, closing the distance on the sneering Loki in an instant. Loki reached to grab the Viking by the scruff of the neck, but he brushed the lunge aside with his left hand, exposing Loki's face. The Viking launched his fist, clashing with a crack into Loki's nose. The fool reeled backwards and fell to a slump in the ground. His nose was broken, flat against his face and gushing blood. The Viking couldn't decide whether he'd been uglier before or after. He shook out his fingers and his sore knuckles cracked, and then he walked home, whistling in sheer satisfaction. Believe it or not, Loki didn't so much as point his crooked nose the Viking's way again after that day. The Viking finished his schooling years in peace. When it was all over, the Viking felt it was his duty to join the military. Odinism had taught him to value courage, honor, discipline, and industriousness, and he couldn't think of any better way to live by that code. The Viking served honorably in the Anchorage reclamation, but took a potentially fatal wound in battle. He thought he wouldn't make it through alive, and he was sent home for treatment. A nurse named Nora saved his life, and in his dying delirium, she looked to him like a Valkyrie. His first action upon returning to health was finding that woman and marrying her. The two settled down in Sanctuary Hills some years after to start a family. As you might have gathered, the Viking will live his life by the values and beliefs of Odinism, modeling himself on the ancient Nordic gods. After making it out of Vault 111, he will try to live by the Odinic rite, which promotes the following characteristics: courage, truth, honor, fidelity, discipline, hospitality, self-reliance, industriousness, and perseverance. The Viking will have no problem fending for himself and will adopt a code of strength over weakness, pride over humility, and knowledge over faith. In the post-war Commonwealth, only the strong survive, so he will give every ounce of energy he has to ensure that he is the strongest. As you can tell, there is little room in his beliefs for malevolence. He's not going to be tempted by evil desires, and he won't allow evils to happen while he's there to do anything about it. But despite this, he understands the way of the world and will not hinder his own growth to be mankind's savior. Like the Vikings of old, he will see the benefit of pillaging and raiding from those he is not bound to by honor and loyalty. That especially applies to factions who would kill him if he didn't aid their cause. When the strong prevail in battle, they are entitled to the spoils of war, so he can loot until his heart is content. His allegiances to factions may vary depending on your personal preference. The Minutemen align with some of his beliefs, but at the same time they aren't necessarily the strongest, do not put an emphasis on dominance over foes like the Viking does. The Institute are an option, as they will do what it takes to deliver the killing blow to meddling factions. On top of this, the Institute may be preferable to the Railroad and the Brotherhood, not necessarily due to any ideological similarities, but simply because working with them will rid the Wasteland of any factions, thus freeing up the Commonwealth to be ruled by you. And the Raiders, of course. Once you tame the Raiders and bring them under your control, you can take over the Commonwealth officially for yourself. When you do this, siding with the Pack and the Disciples will give you some important perks for the Vikings playstyle. At the start of the game, the Vikings special stats will be 9 strength, 1 perception, 4 endurance, 1 charisma, 1 intelligence, 8 agility, and 4 luck. The special book in Sean's room would be put into luck, so you can get the Idiot Savant perk as early as possible. Strength, as you can see, is a priority for this berserker, and this stat, along with the perks in the stat line, will allow the Viking to strike his foes with a might rivaling that of Thor's hammer. While it is only 4 to begin with, endurance will be an important skill by the end of this build. By the end of the build, this stat will give the Viking the power to prevail against all odds, whether in battle with men, monsters, or simply the elements. He will also thrive in the sunlight, feeling the warmth of his god's approval. Agility is another specialty of the Vikings. Viking warriors were known to be big and tough, but they also benefited from the freedom of mobility and the improved range of motion provided by the lack of heavy armor. With his skill, he's going to be able to charge through his opponents, fueled by berserker rage, a Viking war trance of illimitable rage and ferocity. Lastly, there's luck, and as the Viking mows through foes, delivering countless death throes, you won't be surprised when Tyr, the god of war's blessing is upon him. With this stat and the associated perks, the Viking's axe will find major arteries or sever limbs with almost every strike. But now as you know the stats, let's delve into the specifics as we take you through each individual perk to take on your journey. We would usually mention which perks are priorities, but in this case, all of them are uniquely important and deserve a minute of spotlight. Make sure you grab a screenshot of our perks list so you can get the optimal benefit out of each level. First up, there's strength. From this stat line, your first pick will be big leagues. With this perk fully optimized, your attacks with melee weapons will do double damage and also have a chance to disarm or cripple a foe. On top of that, you'll hit all enemies in range with each swing of your axe, and you'll even have the chance to grand slam their heads clean off their shoulders. Next from strength is armorer, and this is the perk that will give you access to all the important armor modifications. Take all 4 ranks of this to unlock all 4 ranks of armor mods. Simple. Then we have Rooted. This perk is a must for a Viking warrior who is completely unfazed and does not falter no matter what his enemies throw at him. Maxed out, this perk will give you plus 50 damage resistance, and your muscles will sometimes be so overwhelmingly solid that they disarm an attacking melee opponent. This perk will also beef up your melee damage by 50%. All of these effects come into play when you're standing still in battle, and what's even better about this is it works perfectly alongside a perk we'll be getting into soon called Blitz. Before though, let's talk about endurance. As I said, you will need to add some power to the stat itself, totaling a 5 perk point investment. So without the bobblehead, your base endurance will go from 4 to 9. That will make you ridiculously tough, but also open up some doors in regards to perks. Grab Adamantium Skeleton. This perk, fully optimized, will completely negate limb damage, which is brilliant if you plan on soaking up blows from your enemies. The other perk of note here is the first rank of Solar Powered. This will grant you plus 2 strength and plus 2 endurance between the hours of 6 AM and 6 PM. Next up is Agility. The first thing to do here is to add 1 perk point to the base stat to open the door to 1 massively important perk. Then take all ranks of Action Boy for that 75% action point regeneration. That'll ensure you're never going too long without VATS attacks or power attacks. Moving target is next, and while you think you may be a tank while you're standing still, this perk will ensure that when you aren't rooted in place, you're just as tanky and effective. All ranks of this perk will give you plus 50 damage resistance and plus 50 energy resistance while sprinting. Sprinting will also cost 50% fewer action points. Now the next perk is quite an addition to the Vikings arsenal. With all ranks of Blitz, using VATS for melee combat not only becomes viable, but ridiculously powerful. This perk will hugely increase VATS melee distance, and the further you travel using the perk, the more damage you will deal. This perk is amazing for closing large gaps between you and ranged enemies, spraying bullets into you from outside of your axe's reach. The stats and perks mentioned above will make you a formidable force, but in addition to a bit of good fortune, this will make the world of difference. Start off by adding 3 perk points to the luck stat, and then grab 3 ranks of Bloody Mess for 15% bonus damage in combat and some visual enhancements to your kills. The increased blood and gore will surely fuel your bloodlust and your berserker rage. 2 ranks of Idiot Savant will hugely improve leveling. This perk will randomly give you 5 times XP for any action, and with an intelligence of only 1, make sure you don't grab the bobblehead, your chance of triggering this multiplier will be way higher. The next perk is Critical Banker, and this will allow you to save precious crits earned in VATS for your tougher enemies. With all ranks, you can store up to 4 criticals to execute whenever you choose. You will also want better criticals, which gives you 2.5 times more critical damage. Add to this 4-leaf clover, which with all ranks gives each hit in VATS an excellent chance of immediately filling your critical meter, and you'll be executing crits left, right, and center. With all of these perks in play, the Viking will be able to rely on nothing but his agility, strength, and axe to deal with just about every threat. Distances can be closed with insane speed, and the sheer quantity of crits will give you tons and tons of one-hit kills. At the end of the game, and with all of the bobbleheads, except intelligence of course, the Viking's special stats will be 10 strength, 2 perception, 10 endurance, 2 charisma, 1 intelligence, 10 agility, and 9 luck. As for gear, the best way to nail those Viking vibes is by getting the Pack Moose helmet from the Nuka World DLC, and then the following armor pieces. You will want heavy treated variants of leather armor pieces on both arms and legs. Get the arms weighted and the legs custom fitted. Add to that a sturdy metal chest piece with asbestos lining and the standard default paint job. The Viking's weapon of choice is great fun, fits the aesthetic, and even perfectly lines up with the backstory and roleplay. Roleplaying. This is of course Grognak's axe from Hubris Comics. This axe causes opponents to stagger and make the target bleed. It also has a hidden ability to cost less AP in VATS. Most medium speed melee weapons get 3 swings in at 7 agility, while Grognak's axe gets roughly twice that. As for companions, there are a few options depending on who you want to bring with you. Gage, Kate, and Strong all sort of suit the Viking style. Don't worry too much about settlements until you reach the Nuka-Well DLC. After that, take over the Commonwealth and all of its settlements with the Raider gangs. Subscribe to FudgeMuppet and give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Don't forget that timestamps can be found in the description to help you find your way about. Also in the description are links to our social media accounts, so give us a follow to stay up to date with everything Fudge. Thanks so much for watching, guys. My name's Scott, and I'll see you next time.